Stone Cold Prose, building better words.
Why are so many men lost nowadays? Why does society dunk on men every chance it gets? Why are the people who physically built the world we live in treated as second-class citizens within it, regardless of their race, their color, or their creed? And why do so many who are biologically male not even qualify as men by any reasonable standard? Who failed who, and how can we fix this mess? Hi guys, welcome back to Stone Cold Prose, where we build better words, better thoughts, and better men. I'm Miles Watson, novelist and author of numerous award-winning series, including Cage Life, Sinner's Cross, and The Chronicles of Magnus, just to name a few. I worked in Hollywood for 12 years, law enforcement for another 10, and now I break it all down and build it back better. So let's get into this. Anyone who is honest with themselves would say that masculinity is in a very bad way nowadays, not just in the West, as so many are fond of pointing out, but all throughout the world. Men feel isolated, disaffected, and disenfranchised. The ordinary man feels as if society in general, and women in particular, has no use for him, or perhaps even worse, sees him as something to be used and then discarded when whim or convenience calls for it. Now I have to start by pointing out that men have always been viewed as disposable in a literal sense. In the ancient Germanic tribes, for example, women were taught to fight, but they were not sent to fight unless the tribe was in immediate danger of total extermination. The tribes understood that a single surviving man could fertilize 100 women in a matter of weeks, but a single surviving woman could only bear at most a dozen or so children over a dozen or so years, no matter how many men she was surrounded by or how virile they happened to be. Men protected the future of the tribe, but women ensured it. Men were valuable as hunters, as gatherers, as builders, as warriors, but they were expendable, expected to die if need be so that the tribe could continue. They accepted this awesome responsibility in part because it came with the benefits of leadership and societal dominance. Most tribes were patriarchies, albeit ones where the sexes had clearly defined and important roles. Men, as I said, did the building, the hunting, the gathering, the fighting, and the hardest of the farming. Women bore the children and raised them and cooked and mended, and in some societies were responsible for part or all of the spiritual welfare of the tribe. They also held men accountable for failures of masculinity, witness the Spartans. Neither role was less important than the other. Neither was more important. The two halves joined and formed a whole. In various tribal groupings across various lands and various times, the roles varied somewhat, but they were recognizably the same. Specifics varied, but the strength, speed, and aggression of men was channeled into roles best suited for them as logic would dictate, and vice versa. Now, central to the ancient concepts of manhood was the rite of passage. This varied enormously from time to time and place to place, but every society had complicated rites by which boys and girls became men and women. In one Germanic tribe, for example, boys wore iron collars around their necks until they had killed their first man in battle. In other tribes, throughout the rest of the world, rites of passage included circumcision without anesthetic, enduring pain without flinching, tests of physical endurance and feats of physical strength and prowess, surviving poisons, and hunting men or beasts. These rites were not merely designed to ensure that the tribe had men sufficiently tough to protect the tribe against hazards, but to draw a stark and unmistakable line between boyhood and manhood. If you ever saw Roots, you remember when Kunta Kinte returned from his own passage rite and told off his mother for addressing him as a boy. My point is, nobody had to guess. When a Roman soldier in AD 70 whatever came up against a Semnon warrior in Germany, he knew by the knot in the warrior's hair that he was up against a man and had to proceed accordingly. The onset of what we call civilization gradually wore down and eventually eradicated the formal rite of passage. The process was slow and insidious, so slow and insidious that generations and even centuries passed without anyone noticing it had taken effect. Until just a few decades ago, actually, and I know because I was there, it was normal for boys to be told to be a man in tough situations, as if they were to have inculcated the knowledge of how to do this with their sodas and comic books and Saturday cartoons. Probably the first generation in the United States called to be men without having undergone even an informal rite of passage was the Vietnam generation, the boomers. Prior to that era, America was nowhere near as materially comfortable as it was later to become, and most people went without and expected relatively little in the way of creature comfort or even bare necessity. My grandparents. Nearly every generation going back to colonial times had some form of collective trauma they had to endure. War, civil war, drought, famine, currency collapse, something. A lot of the trauma some veterans manifested upon returning from Vietnam was probably due to the fact that they were the children of the victors of World War II and had been raised in the most materially prosperous society the world had ever seen. Only then to end up in the middle of a savage conflict without the same benefit of privation and harshness that their fathers had endured during the Great Depression. They had not undergone that informal rite of passage which hardened their parents' generation and made the horror of World War II marginally more endurable. Why did the rite of passage disappear? It has to do with the transition of humanity from nomadic or semi-nomadic tribal societies to societies that lived behind walls. With the invention of the city, the need for every male to become the all-purpose builder, hunter, gatherer, warrior, and scout faded away, and the stratification of males began in earnest. Some were turned into soldiers, it's true, but others specialized in the trades, or they became merchants or members of a clerical or priestly class, while others tilled the fields, and so on and so forth. Over time, the rite of passage for men became a formality without any substance and was eventually abandoned altogether. Manhood came with a set of expectations, but exactly when a boy became a man and under what circumstances were blurry and vague. And they tended to center around the idea of hitting a certain age or just taking on adult responsibility. A boy was a boy, for example, until the day he was old enough to go to the factory or the mines and work and make a wage, whereupon he began the transition to manhood, which he completed presumably when he took a wife and fathered children. But this only applied to the working class, not the merchant class or the wealthy, whose boys could linger and dawdle in adolescence much, much longer by virtue of just staying in school, which, let's face it, has less to do with education and more with social separation from the working class, something which was doubly achieved by going off to college, which also allowed adolescence to extend still further into the teenage and even 20-something years. I myself didn't even get a part-time job till I was 15 or 16 years old, and I didn't work anything approaching office hours until the summer after my senior year of high school. Not because I was lazy, although I was lazy, actually, but because there was no economic necessity for me to work and bring money home to the family. When I expressed a desire to join the Army when I was 18, my father, who came from the working class and worked his way out of it, wanted me to be an officer rather than enlist. Probably because in his mind, me enlisting represented a societal retrogression. Middle-class kids who joined the service were supposed to be officers. Poor and working-class people were the privates. For boys who wanted to feel like men, unofficial rites of passage such as military service, contact sports, undergoing hazing rituals in fraternities, moving out of their parents' house and getting their own place and a full-time job, so on and so forth and such, had to do, but they were not necessarily recognized by society individually or in mass. A male could do all of these things and still be considered a boy if he was cowardly, immature, or most importantly, if he just avoided responsibility, especially in times of national crisis. When I made my study of propaganda used by governments in World War I, nearly all of it, regardless of the country that produced the propaganda, centered around the necessity of men stepping up to protect women and children from harm. Manhood may have been achieved in a peacetime sense, but it was abrogated completely if that man failed to get into uniform in time of war. When the Titanic sank, the old rule of women and children first was strictly obeyed. 70% of those who survived were women, another 10% were children, and the remaining 20% were men. This is because the men gave up their seats on the lifeboats, obeying the societal code that in a time of crisis, they were expendable and had to be sacrificed to the tribe. But this tradition, like the rest, is only vaguely still in existence. Gender roles having been deliberately destroyed without anything summoned up to replace them, rites of passage having almost completely been abolished, the duties of manhood no longer clearly exist in any meaningful, definable way. In 1996, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Krulak, decreed that every Marine recruit would undergo during his or her final days of training a 56-hour ritual known as the Crucible, during which the recruits had to go to almost without food or sleep while performing a whole series of complex physical tasks under very high stress, which culminated in a long march in full pack when the recruits were already totally exhausted, sleep deprived, and hungry. Krulak's logic was that Marines needed a culminating event, a rite of passage, which would stand out in a Marine's mind as the moment he or she became a Marine. In other words, the commandant was trying to supply to his people what society had denied them, a transformative ritual that began with boys and ended up with men. In Dune 1, we see the Sardaukar, the army of the Emperor of the known universe, undergoing a blood rite before they enter battle. This short sequence is far and away the most popular in the film, especially among men. I believe that this is because there is something in the sequence which speaks to the genetic programming of males, their 100,000-year-old need not merely to grow into manhood, but to earn it, to prove themselves, and to be formally recognized by their community for having done so. In today's society, lacking any standardized rituals, men seek to prove themselves in all sorts of silly ways, but the definition of manhood remains shifty and elusive, even subjective. Many males embrace a kind of hyper-masculine exterior without being willing to take on any adult responsibility. They have the equipment, but not the code. Others abandon any pretense of traditional masculinity and make no effort in that direction at all. They're effeminate, weak, cowardly, soft, basically helpless, and completely unashamed of it. Still others live in this kind of foggy confusion of where gender roles begin and end, or even if they're supposed to exist at all, and no longer feel comfortable exerting their traditional roles vis-a-vis women. They don't help a woman they see in distress. Why would you in the age of total equality? They don't need no man, after all. Some years ago, I was talking to a man who said that he'd been a lifelong member of PETA, but had recently quit in disgust. When I asked him why he quit, he said, PETA is no longer pro-animal, it's anti-human. I feel much the same way about third-wave feminism. It's no longer pro-women, which I'm up for, it's anti-man. For psychological reasons, too nebulous and complex to go into here, modern feminism has in essence become an attack upon men and masculinity, and it's an attack that men permitted and submitted to in the name of societal harmony. But in doing so, we lost our last foothold on the ideas of traditional masculinity and have been in a free fall ever since. Gender may be a societal construct, but sex is not. Men are genetically designed to perform certain tasks, which is why most men engage in activities which are not societally necessary, but provide them with a deep sense of satisfaction. Hunting, fishing, shooting, woodworking, fixing engines, studying martial arts, participating in contact or extreme sports, chopping wood, and so on. These things are an attempt to reconnect with their masculinity in a society that, for its own perverse reasons, has told them they're unnecessary and even toxic. The late, great Kevin Samuels used to remark frequently that men conquered the land, they tilled the soil, they paved the roads, they farmed the fields, they built the buildings, patrolled the streets, put out the fires, invented the machinery, and made the repairs upon it, and now that the world they had created was safe and secure and comfortable and free from most threats, suddenly they were the bad guys and no longer required. They were made to feel like shit about their accomplishments and told they were threatening because of their size and their strength and their aggression, and that they hadn't done anything women couldn't have done or wouldn't have done even better. They were told that dying in the first wave at Omaha Beach, or getting their legs cut off in a factory accident, or being buried alive in a coal mine collapse, made them part of the patriarchy, a villainous cabal of bullying, cynical, cigar-smoking misogynists that kept women barefoot and preggers and slaving over stoves in cramped and crowded kitchens. Never was there an acknowledgement that if being a housewife sucked in a lot of ways, if it was a dirty and laborious, never-ending grind that required numerous overlapping abilities and skills which often were taken for granted by men, nailing roof shingles in place for 16 hours a day in 100-degree temperatures, or working on a high-rise construction site, or digging ditches for a sewer line, or driving a cab or an 18-wheeler, or pounding a beat, wasn't any freaking fun either. Never was there an acknowledgement that societal roles were created due to the strength differential between men and women and by basic biological differences, not due to some dark conspiracy to keep women in their place. Most men that I know, regardless of what race they are, or what their social class is, or what political affiliation they might have, are perfectly happy to share the labors of life with women in the workplace or anywhere else. This isn't 1928. Technology has reduced the need for sex and gender roles in many places. No, the issue here is the idea of the sexual zero-sum game, the notion that for women to rise, men must fall, that it's impossible to be pro-woman without also being anti-man. That idea is pernicious bullshit. It was born out of bad faith arguments, and it's maintained by bad faith arguments and misandry. The war in Ukraine is a daily reminder that when a nation is confronted with an existential crisis, it is the men who must offer themselves up in sacrifice so that the people, the nation, can continue its existence. To be called upon to make this sacrifice is at the essence of masculinity, of manhood. It's the most awesome of all the responsibilities and duties to which men can be called upon to perform. To attack masculinity, to attack men, to deny them rites of passage and clearly define societal roles, is a form of cultural suicide. It's a deliberate sawing off of the limb on which your ass is sitting. The time may come, and soon, when this nation and the West itself finds itself faced with a life or death situation and reaches for its last best hope, its men, only to discover the species is extinct. Plenty of males with triple chins and STEAM accounts and degrees in gender studies will be available, but no men. When and if that moment arrives, those responsible for this cultural sabotage will have a great deal to answer for. I would prefer that moment not come, and for us to avoid it, we must give the most serious consideration to the notion of once again formally training boys to be men, both in our school systems and in the home, of giving them rites of passage which will install in them not only masculine pride, but a sense of duty and responsibility to those around them and to their society as a whole. This is not a fantastical idea. It could be done and it should be done, and it's up to the men we have remaining to see that it is done. It is not enough to play Grandpa Simpson. In my day, we walked uphill to school both ways. We can't just complain about the youth and comfort ourselves with a vague sense of superiority. As men, we have a responsibility to guide them. And if we fail in this task, we too surrender our manhood. Folks, if you enjoyed today's video, please remember to like, subscribe, comment, hit the notification bell, and remember to check out my books on Amazon. The link is in the description if I remember to put it there. I drop scripted content every Friday at 3 p.m., shorts every day, and unscripted rambles whenever rage moves me to do so. I'll see you next time, and until then, stay cold and stay strong.